Hello and welcome to our program this evening with Menachem Kaiser, author of the newly released book, Plunder, a memoir of family property and Nazi treasure. This event is co-hosted by the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center and the American Inspiration Author Series, both at the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and in partnership with the Society's Brew Family Learning Center. My name is Rachel King. I'm the Executive Director of the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center, and I will be your host this evening. The Jewish Heritage Center is a destination for exploring and preserving the history of Jewish families and institutions in New England and beyond. We are an archive, an educational center, and a family history resource located at New England Historic Genealogical Society, America's founding genealogical organization. Before we begin this evening, I would like to make a couple of notes about this webinar. You in the audience are automatically muted. If you have any questions during the presentation and then during the question and answer session, please type them into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to answer as many as we can. Please note also that we are broadcasting remotely, so bear with us if we experience any technological issues. Even if we lose the connection or if you miss something on your end, you will have access to the full recording of this session afterward. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker and our moderator today. Menachem Kaiser grew up in Toronto and received his BA from Columbia University and his MFA from the University of Michigan. In 2010, he was a Fulbright Fellow in Lithuania. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, in New York Magazine, The Atlantic, Vogue, and elsewhere. He currently lives in Brooklyn. Menachem will be in conversation with Dr. Bernice Lerner, who is senior scholar at Boston University's Center for Character and Social Responsibility. Bernice has a master's from the Jewish Theological Seminary and a doctorate from Boston University, and has taught several courses related to the Holocaust and character. The Jewish Heritage Center hosted a program with Bernice in February about her own Holocaust memoir entitled All the Horrors of War, a Jewish Girl, a British Doctor, and the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen, recounting her mother's experience during and after imprisonment at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. We are really looking forward to hearing these two writers discuss Plunder, family stories, and the unique genre of Holocaust memoir. Please join me in welcoming Menachem Kaiser and Bernice Lerner.
Thank you so much, Rachel. First I want to just thank the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center. I know from working with you in February that you are consummate professionals, and what a joy to be here again. And what an honor to be in conversation with Menachem Kaiser. Menachem's book, Plunder, is beautifully written. It's unlike anything I've read before, relating to the Holocaust, and I'm really looking forward to asking you some questions, Menachem. So first, I just want to say on a personal note, this book is about Menachem's quest. It starts with Menachem's quest to see if he could obtain the apartment building that was in his family, that was in his grandfather's. And he goes down many side paths and has a lot of reflections on that experience. And for me, personally, it was fascinating because this building was in Sosnowiec, and Menachem, you could tell me if I pronounced that wrong, but I had written a biography of a child survivor from Sosnowiec. The other thing is Menachem encounters and spends time with these treasure hunters, which is a fascinating discovery, meeting these people who are exploring, looking for treasure in these underground tunnels that were part of the Gross Rosen concentration camp. And my mother was imprisoned for a while in a subsidiary of Gross Rosen, and talks about one of the tunnels that she had been in. So there were a lot of like personal points of connection, and I loved it. I just really, really sank into Menachem's language and was in really awe of your accomplishment, Menachem. So congratulations. So my first question to you is, you mentioned, you just sort of throw out that you had been in Poland 12 times, and I think it was before you even began this exploration. So I really wanted, and you seemed so comfortable in Poland, even though you didn't speak the language. You're not shy. You befriended people. You hired people when you needed to hire people. You became very familiar with that country. And I'm wondering, what was the prior research that you had been doing there? What brought you to Poland before this exploration?
Sure. Let me just open by saying what a pleasure it is to be here. And thank you to Rachel, Courtney, and Stephanie, and to you, Bernice, for hosting the event and for organizing it. That's a good question. So I initially went to Eastern Europe in 2010 for my Fulbright. Up until that point, I pretty much knew nothing about the region. And I would say, I had a family connection. Like that's where 3 out of my 4 grandparents were from. But I still didn't know any particulars of that history and had never really felt all that compelled to go. I went to Lithuania on my Fulbright to study Yiddish and like the post-war Yiddish culture. That turned out to not go so well. Basically, my research entirely imploded on my second day there. And I ended up researching the Vilna ghetto. And so that became my primary focus for my year. And then this is a little bit of like a long and zany story. Towards the end of my year there, I ended up meeting an American Hasidic guy who was the manager of the German supergroup, the Scorpions. And he turned out to be the child of the chief rabbi of Galicia, and so who was based in Krakow. And so they invited me to come to Poland for Rosh Hashanah. And, up until that point, I don't know, it was probably like a coin flip if I ever would have gone to Poland. But I had this personal invitation, so I decided to go. And once I was there, I felt like almost immediately immersed, I'd say. It was really, I had a very frustrating year in Lithuania. I had not found a lot of institutional resources. I hadn't found that friendly. I hadn't found that open. I had like an incredible year, but also a very hard year. And I found in Poland just like an unbelievably rich place and I'm sure you've experienced this as well. When you're there, it's like almost overwhelming. Like the people you meet, the questions you'll encounter. And so I was very, very taken with it. And so for the next few years, while I was doing my research on the Vilna Ghetto, I kind of based myself in Krakow. And so I would go to Krakow and just kind of hop over to Vilnius when I needed to. And then from 2011, 2015, I went once or twice a year to Eastern Europe, mostly to Poland. And I got more and more interested in Polish, these questions of Polish memory and Jewish memory. And then it wasn't until 2015 when I finally went to that building, when I tried, when I initiated the reclamation efforts, that it became much more personal. And so by the time really when the book starts, I had invested quite a bit of time, had built up quite a large network. And you're right, was very, very comfortable in the region.
That's extraordinary. It's not just a hop over from Krakow to Vilnius, right? How did you always like rent, like you're just practical wise? Did you rent a car?
I just found it, I will say from like the first time I was in Poland until the last, I found people to be so open and so receptive to me personally and also to my work. And I found I just needed to ask and people would open doors. If I needed a translator, I could easily find a translator. If I needed to know someone I spent first a lot of time in Krakow, met a lot of people there. And then I was like, oh, now I need to go into Wrocław or Warsaw. And everyone was so unbelievably helpful. So it's somewhat a function of me, but it's much more a function of the people I encountered and how willing they were to help me.
So I'm just curious what happened in Lithuania. like when your research imploded? I mean, you got a Fulbright and you obviously wrote a proposal to do this research.
Yeah.
What happened?
Basically, my research advisor was a bit of a rabble rouser, and he had ruffled some feathers and had been fired from the university the summer before I went. So after I received my Fulbright, before I moved, and so once I really had no anchor. I'd also been not necessarily misled, and the fault is mine, about how much post-war Yiddish culture there actually was, and there was a dearth of it. And so again, to contrast, when I went to Poland, I found tremendous vibrancy and a tremendous, like, a lot of like sort of action in these questions of Yiddish and Jewish culture. And so Lithuania, like outside of like 3 weeks a year when they have a really interesting, a really successful Yiddish program, there really wasn't that much. And so this happens to quite a few Fulbrighters, actually. They show up and they feel they really didn't get a handle of like what is actually going on the ground, and they have to adapt.
Hmm, that's interesting. And something else I was wondering about really all throughout your book was you go on this quest and there's a lot of people really who potentially could have a stake in this building that was owned by your grandfather and his family. So there were your cousins, there were your siblings, and you mentioned your father just a little bit, right? He was your conduit to your grandfather. Like it was from really your father. Like I'm curious about him being sort of a daughter of survivors. He was a son of survivors. What he didn't seem to know all that much, but he seemed to know that your grandfather wouldn't have been terribly interested in your pursuit of the building. And you seem like later in the book, you seem to keep your father abreast of your work, like your discovery of your grandfather's cousin, Abraham Kaiser. But I don't really get a sense of what was he really thinking of what you were doing, and what were your siblings and cousins thinking about this? Like how did the family look at you?
Sure. So let me mention, for those who haven't read the book, that sort of the central narrative of the book is my attempts to reclaim a property that had belonged to my great grandfather and that my grandfather had tried to reclaim for about 30 years after the war and failed. And so the book starts when I sort of pick up that mission. Um, and what you're right. So I would say, growing up, I would say my family's Holocaust history was very undetailed. It was very present and very untextured. It was like something we knew, obviously we knew about it and we identified as grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, but none of us knew really the first detail of what they went through and really had no access to that information. My grandfather died about 8 years before I was born, and my grandmother didn't talk about it, not until her later years. And so when I started this reclamation, my family was interested, but it was still very, very abstract. Um, it was, I would like, and you also have to put into context, I was going, twice a year. I was coming back with these crazy stories. I'd come back and be like, yeah, okay, the building. And then I was like, oh, I met these treasure hunters. And so it was sort of like, it got a little bit bundled into like Menachem zany adventures in Eastern Europe. And this building, people were tracking it. People were very interested, but it was kind of a hard story to get a handle on until, I quite literally wrote a book. And once it became not abstract, I think sort of the sentimental value of that building became much more apparent. And like my father's been very invested in it, very interested. Before COVID hit, the plan was actually to go to Sosnowiec for a court hearing with my father. He's never been there before. And that was something I actually initially wanted to end the book like that, like a father-son journey to the courthouse for what I had hoped was going to be the final hearing. That didn't end up being, but it's an interesting tension, like a real investment in the story, but also it's somewhat abstract because it's far away. You don't have details, you don't have visuals. It's a complicated story. It's stretched at this point. It's been 6 years since I started the reclamation process. It's not an easy story to tell. So it's like you know, like a and I will say, since the book's been written, it's been like a real watershed in the family story, because people all of a sudden are able to understand it and to embrace it and really to like say it over and make it their own.
Mhm. So what was the reason that your father didn't think that his father would have been too interested in this pursuit?
I wouldn't say he didn't think he clearly my grandfather was interested because he tried for 30 years. I think it became a question of priorities. And so what my grandfather would have wanted most. And so my father and I had in the book, I recount a difficult, but very, I would say, significant conversation between us when we sort of compared notes of what my grandfather would have wanted most from me. And so I really try to interrogate the concept of inheritance and expand it, not just about sort of material inheritance, whether it be a building or money, but about this notion of spiritual inheritance and the concept of tradition. I grew up in an Orthodox home, which places a very significant emphasis on tradition. And my father was coming to me in a way that I found actually very meaningful and very loving, and saying, you know, the idea of tradition was very, very important to my father, i.e. to my grandfather. And this should be part of your concept of inheritance. I had been sort of dealing with the narrow band of what inheritance is. My father was asking me to expand that.
Interesting. So I'm curious, and this may be of interest to other people who have questions for you about doing something similar, if they know they inherited, or they might be inheriting, or could potentially inherit property in Eastern Europe. Was it at all financially motivated? Was that a consideration or a factor? Because the apartment, I don't know if it was Killer, the lawyer you were working with, or who estimated that it was worth, I don't know, $400,000 to $500,000. Was that it?
So complicated question. Initially, when I started this, I assumed kind of naively that the building would be worth very, very little, which speaks to my own ignorance of Polish real estate. I assumed it'd be in the vicinity of $30,000 to $50,000, and that it's, you know, from a financial standpoint, that's probably not worth, let's say, 5 to 10 years it would take to reclaim it. During that initial meeting, the lawyers, you know, did some sort of back of the envelope calculations, looked up what the square footage in that neighborhood might be worth, and it was probably worth closer to $400,000 to $600,000. And so that is a very significant amount of money. That said, it would be split multiple ways. It's not me. Like I'm not the benefactor. There's a generation above me. And so the amount of money I would get is pretty minimal, if any. I'll put up to, on the other side, my lawyer, you know, if for those who've read the book, know that the lawyer wasn't necessarily the greatest lawyer in the world, but she did her job, and it was very cheap. Like, I don't actually detail how much was in the book, but it was very, very reasonable, a fraction of what it would be to hire an American lawyer. Again, I've been using this lawyer since 2015. And so I will say the financial cost wasn't great. And so that really, if it had cost me quite a bit of money, I think it would have been a lot harder to justify, especially with an outcome that's very much in question throughout. And then what's a little bit of a complicating question here is that I ended up signing a book deal in 2017, which, you know, it is a nice chunk of money, but more important, that was an important career milestone for me. And that is a complicated question of what my motivations were vis-a-vis the actual writing of the book. But, you know, once you start going down that rabbit hole, it will get very meta very quick. And so I try not to, but certainly when you ask about motivations, I wouldn't discount that.
Okay, so so along those lines, can you tell me a little bit about the contract and what it was like? Interesting publisher, and what was that journey like?
Sure. So at the time I was in graduate school. I was doing an MFA in fiction writing. And I was actually initially adamantly opposed to writing a book like this. I did not see a way to do it interestingly. I did not want to write about Eastern Europe. I did not want to write about the Holocaust. I didn't want to write about my grandfather, who I didn't know. A big reason for that is that even though I found what was happening to me interesting and meaningful, I didn't see a way to make an interesting and meaningful story out of it that would sort of resonate with others. Because again, I did not know my grandfather. And I felt like if it didn't have a sentimental arc, either one, it would be kind of fallow, or I would end up sort of semi-consciously inventing it, and sort of it would have like a sort of false sentimentality that I didn't know how to avoid. And so I was actually saying, I am not going to write about this. I was here to write fiction. I was much more interested. And my time in Poland at that point, I was doing research for a novel. And then the year after I started the reclamation process, a little bit of a longer story, but I fell in with the treasure hunters and found a familial connection with them. Ended up becoming a celebrity in my own right among the treasure hunters. And at that point, the story got so weird that I felt I had to at least try to write a book. And so I had a fellowship year, 2016 to 2017 from the University of Michigan. A good chunk of that time I spent putting together a book proposal. At the end of summer 2017, actually, while I was in the field, mostly with the treasure hunters, we sent out the book proposal, had interest from a number of publishers, but they all asked, they were said, will you reclaim this building? It's very important that we know the ending. And I was confident at that point that I would within 10 months. And I said I would. And then we signed the contract. And so it's an interesting thing with nonfiction books is that they sort of become a concrete project while you're still writing them. And that could sort of impact how you write. And in my case, it impacted what I even wrote about because I was sort of committed to getting this building back, even though that wasn't an outcome, and in fact did not happen in time. I sailed past my deadline without any conclusion to the court case. And so I was in a little bit of a pickle and I had to figure that out.
Did you skip the agent step, getting an agent, or did you work through an agent?
I met an agent in grad school. I showed her two projects, one, the book proposal, and one was a finished novel about Yiddish poets. And we decided that a book that has Nazi gold in it is a more marketable book than a book about Yiddish poets. And so we went with that one first.
Interesting. So this is also interesting to me. So in your writing, I mean, this weird thing that happened, meeting the treasure hunters and going down, there were so many sort of, in the biography, I'm a biographer, and we call it sort of going down the primrose path. And you took so many interesting paths, and they were just, fascinating. And I actually think the part about finding these treasure hunters and then how they revered your grandfather's cousin, Menachem Kaiser, who was in his own right a great writer. Like if it's in, I mean, the excerpts from his writing are just beautiful, like your prose. This is to me like, I'm fascinated by it. I was intrigued by it. I think you did it beautifully. And in my own writing, and maybe this is a flaw in my writing, but I tried to steer clear of it. I went down many paths in my writing, but those never made the final cut. And like, I'm thinking, could I have written a book like you about sort of my research and exploration and the weird things that happened? And maybe I should have gone that route, but I almost didn't dare. So I admire that you did. And I'm wondering, in the process of writing it, is there anything that you wrote, any stories that didn't make the final cut?
Oh, great. The answer, yes, for sure. A large section that got cut was, there was a lot more treasure hunter material. I spent a lot of time with them. So I ended up going to two of their festivals, which kind of operate as treasure hunter conferences. And I ended up speaking at them and spending quite a bit of time with them. A lot of sort of what they call expeditions or explorations, that didn't make the cut. I ended up visiting all the Riza, which are the tunnels that slave laborers built. Any other tons of stuff gets left on the cutting floor, that's for sure. And then I'm trying to think of any other large set pieces. A lot of the treasure hunter stuff didn't make it. And then I took many trips to this building. Like I went probably 10, 12 times to visit the building. Each time was kind of unique and I learned more, but a lot of those didn't make it in. Only two really made it in. Yeah, and a big one is like in the initial draft, when I visit Israel and I meet my new relatives, I initially had a full chapter on meeting them. And we made the decision to cut that chapter.
Oh, that's so interesting. And in terms of what was included in the writing, did it involve many rewrites? Did it just flow out of you as as beautiful writing sometimes appears to have done, just like flows? Or did you,
No.
because I don't know about you, but I agonize over every word, and you had like sometimes a string of like adjectives, and I thought, and each one added a different dimension or a greater understanding, and I thought, how does he do that? Like how? So I'm just wondering about the process of writing and editing yourself and working with an editor.
Sure. First of all, thank you. It's very kind of you. Um, no, it was miserable. I mean, it's miserable just throughout. Basically, I ended up, I don't like somewhat intentionally, but also because I didn't see another way to do this, I ended up writing each chapter very individually. And so each chapter was its own unit. And I barely, there was like a very tentative order, but one that was very loose. And sort of then the challenge became, once I had written each chapter, and probably there was an additional 5 chapters to what made it in the book, so a total of like 23 different chapters. Some of them got combined. Then the question became how to order it. And initially, I tried something a little different. I tried to like sort of separate the narratives of the reclamation and of the treasure hunters. That didn't really work. And I will give a lot of credit to my editor, who is pretty light, I will say, on the sentence level, but who I would say was primarily responsible for sort of conceiving the order of the chapters, which to me was the most challenging thing. And I really feel like I didn't have perspective anymore. I was too close. I just saw, I really just couldn't, I only saw the voids. I saw all the stuff I wasn't saying. I saw the bad transitions. I was wearing whatever the opposite of rose colored glasses is. And so, yeah, she was unbelievably helpful in sort of conceiving the order of the chapters. And then, yeah, after that, you sort of like do these drafts and do the copy edits. And then there was a second round of edits with, I made some changes for my family, actually. We had a little bit of, I changed some stuff because for privacy reasons. And then, but that was happening sort of right simultaneously with the copy edits. And then that was pretty much it. And even all of that, there are still plenty of mistakes, particularly with the Polish. I've been told that there are many, many errors in Polish spelling.
Well, thank you for saying it was miserable, because that is, I mean, people don't realize what goes into it, right? I don't know who said you just sit down at the computer and slit your wrists when you start to write. So
Yeah, it was
it's
terrible.
really, really hard. Um, One thing that struck me in reading your book was how really generous you were in so many ways. Like you were so thoughtful, you were so reflective, and you were trying so hard sometimes to see another's point of view. Just as an example, when you went to the first apartment building that you thought was the one that was in your family, and you were meeting with some of the residents, and you were trying to think about, like, what if people asked you about, you might be displacing people, or they might be threatened. Like, you're thinking about that, but you also point to the absurdity of it. And there was a lot of like points of absurdity, like you have to prove that your relatives are dead, when, like, how are you going to prove that they're dead? They died in the Holocaust. And I just wondered if you ever got really angry because you seemed controlled, you seemed really generous and trying to understand. And like, I live with a lot of absurdities from my family. Like, my mother was offered as part of reparations $30 for each of her siblings that were killed in Auschwitz. Like, she had 4 siblings that died there, and $30 a person. Like, there's a lot of absurd things when it comes to the Holocaust, having to prove things that are just like, if you can't get their birth certificates, you can't get their death certificates. And I was just wondering how you sort of removed yourself and you were so sort of like thinking of the other side. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, about
It's interesting. I think, I mean, it points to like a little bit of a difference between me as a person and me as an author. And so like when you write the book, you can't recount every emotion that you have. And so I definitely like the absurdity reached a fever pitch. I mean, like at a certain point when like I lost the appeal to have the deaths of my relatives who had died in the Holocaust recognized, I was beside myself, but it wasn't quite anger. It was sort of like a submission to the absurdity. And so, but you also have to make these choices when you narrate like what you went through. You have to have a coherent narrative. So like, I didn't have an episode where I like broke a chair, or punched a wall. If I did, I would put it in. And so I didn't have any outbursts. But like, if you and I had been talking, and the week after I got that decision, I would have expressed anger, disappointment. But again, within like a larger narrative, uh, it gets sort of smoothed out into something. And I also, it's very hard to express anger on the page. Like what I don't really know how to do it. To me, whatever is underneath that anger is probably more rich and more interesting. And so you would have that frustration, or sort of emphasizing the absurdity and putting the absurdity into context, sort of poking fun at it. But all that in the moment I might experience as anger, but the sort of the meaty stuff is like once you start unpacking it.
Yeah. You seem to me to live in your head a lot. We get a
I'm very, yeah, that's that part is all accurate. It's
yes.
I don't, nothing is ever unambiguous, really, especially when you're dealing with like questions of memory. Like I didn't experience anything as unambiguous.
Yeah. And that was so interesting to me. And also how the Holocaust, I thought this book really made a contribution to Holocaust literature. And, in a way, it's so hard when it comes to the Holocaust to contribute, because there's been so many memoirs. You point that out. And you talk, and each one, morally it's so important that we have these. But you point out to the sort of common elements that people are talking about: suffering and hunger and pain and torture. And um, it's hard. On the other hand, so it's hard. You didn't want to first write about the Holocaust. So how do you find, a different dimension, something that is going to be a really different sort of contribution? Not to minimize any memoirs or all contributions, but this was a really different sort of book. And I think in a way also it struck me as, well, it's hard, it's also easy, because the event was so vast. There are so many unexplored corners of it, and that you found these treasure hunters. And I was just really, yeah, you had so many interesting things that you included. So I think you really accomplished that in a great way. And yeah, I was wondering also about discovering Abraham Kaiser and the cousin. And you did that in such a wonderful way in the book, because you had his writings, his diary, and he describes how he escaped, which was so interesting for me because my father escaped. And he talks about it with such feeling. Who was he? And then this woman who hid him, and you like tell it all, you show it in his diary, and then you discover this whole like love story, and how you go down these paths with the woman and her children. And you just, I don't know, did you ever hesitate about contacting anyone for the research, or meeting with people? Or how do you, like, for anyone out there who wants to do this kind of work, like how do you like introduce yourself to this woman's children who might remember your grandfather's cousin? Like how do you like knock on the door and say
Yeah.
who you are and get them to reveal things to you and open up to you? So
I like that question. I will say, just with very few exceptions, people are more than happy to share their story. People have stories and they want to tell them. And if you're receptive to hearing them, and if you show up and ask, they'll cooperate. And so this book, it's literally hundreds of people. And so like some of them made it in, some of them didn't make it in, who I've talked to in some capacity, whether it was for an interview or as a guide or as a translator or as a new relative. And with almost no exceptions, people wanted to help me, one, and people wanted to share their experience. And so when I've met, I'll also say for context, for those who haven't read the book, the short version of who Abraham Kaiser was, that there's a very large subculture of treasure hunters in Silesia, which is in southwest Poland, who are very obsessed about a complex of underground tunnels built by the Nazis using Jewish slave labor that have no documentation. And so, but except the sort of primary documentation was a diary written by a Jewish slave laborer named Abraham Kaiser. And on account of the fact that there's virtually nothing else, this diary has become kind of the text, kind of the primary source, and Abraham in turn has become a celebrity. And I found all this out sort of accidentally, and then I found out that not only Abraham and I were related, he was actually my grandfather's closest surviving relative, and the treasure hunters embraced me as a celebrity in my own right. And so that's the other narrative of the book, and sort of when I fall down this rabbit hole. And so to tell a little bit more about the treasure hunters, this is a very large subculture. Treasure hunter is a little bit of a misnomer. And so that they're like obsessed with, I would say, questions about history that are unanswered, particularly World War II. If you sort of think about them as a community, I would say it's over 100,000 people. And so that includes people who go out every weekend with metal detectors on one side of the spectrum. And on the other end, you have very sophisticated, sometimes even sponsored expedition groups with high-end equipment like LiDAR and radar and magnetometers. Now, also, I will mention that treasure hunting in Poland is a regulated activity. You cannot go out, you can't even go out to treasure hunter without a permit. So there is a government agency charged with issuing permits. Anything you find in the ground by law belongs to the government, but there is a long-standing tradition to give a 10% reward. Many treasure hunters flout this law. And so within this large community, I was taken from home to home, taken on many expeditions and explorations, and I saw many private treasure collections, including one guy memorably who built a second home just to house his treasure. So it was kind of a private museum. A lot of it is Nazi paraphernalia. I would say probably 60 to 70%, but it also includes stuff like currency or stuff from the Allies, sometimes stuff from World War I, sometimes stuff from medieval. Just actually a few weeks ago, there was a story of a Polish treasure hunter who found Viking coins. And so you have many, many stories of people finding things. And then to even give a bigger context, the reason I had heard about all this was the Golden Train, which is an ostensibly legendary train full of looted Nazi gold that the Nazis had hid inside of a mountain. And so, according to legend, they had taken all these chests of gold in Wrocław, sent it towards Berlin, but the train got diverted and was maybe hijacked, or maybe it was planned. It was hidden inside of a mountain. And then for the last couple decades, these Polish treasure hunters had been looking for it. And in 2015, two guys claimed to have found it. And the world took it very, very seriously. And so that was my sort of introduction. At that time, I was interested in writing fiction about them. But then I found out about my, personal connection, and the nature of the story changed considerably. So that's some context about who the treasure hunters are. I forgot the original question.
Was it about knocking on people's doors and getting, I don't remember.
Yeah, people are so open and so inviting. That includes treasure hunters, and that includes new family. And like that was like a big a lesson for me. And I was like, to the extent I could pass on words of encouragement to others interested in searching their own history, people are so open and so much more helpful than you have any reason to expect. And it's just like people, they want to, I don't know. And like, I could almost think, but yeah, one or two government officials sort of turned me down, and some people tried to use me, but like, okay, fine, they had their own maybe nefarious purposes, but largely it was just everyone sort of rolled out the carpet. And so I just feel very, very grateful.
Yeah, I found that too in my research. Yeah, people do like to share their stories and be helpful.
I think
Um,
there's a request to show some of these tunnels actually.
oh,
So,
great.
so to give a little bit of context about what these tunnels are, it's called Project Riza, and it's a series of 7 tunnels. There might be more, but we've discovered 7 in various stages of completion. Um, and to give a little bit of context before I show the photos, and so the smaller ones are quite small; they weren't completed, but the larger ones are massive. We're talking square kilometers. We're like 200 meters long, 20-meter high ceilings, and so, which is all to say, these sort of really you could really sink your imagination in, and it's sort of really, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about what they were used for, and again, we have no primary German documentation, and so the conspiracy theories run kind of rampant. And so some of the theories I would hear were anti-gravity or time travel or secret nuclear weapons. Between you and me, what they probably were going to be like an underground factory or a kind of barracks. And so let me show some of the photos. Bernice, could you see that?
Yeah, yeah.
So this is one of the smallest one. This is the first one I visited is called Complex Sabone. For those who read the book, this is actually from that visit. This is my first visit in. This is a photo from that moment. And so as you could see, it's very much a tunnel. This one is not open to the public. Basically, you need to know the GPS coordinates, or you need to know a treasure hunter who will take you. These wooden A-frames are original, so from the war. And it's hard to give a sense of how dark this actually is. This was kind of it's a hole in the middle of a mountain, and it's 150 meters in. This is a very fancy camera with a lot of light shined. This is another angle of Complex Sabone, and you can see how unfinished it is. So this is Complex Osufka, which is one of the larger ones. This one is open to the public, and it operates somewhat like a national park. So you have guides, you're not allowed to go by yourself. This one is much closer to completion, and so you'll see how big it is, but also you can see the reinforced concrete. And so you could sort of get a sense of what it was going to look like. All these were built in the last like 18 months of the war and were guarded very vigilantly. And so anyone who approached would be shot on sight, and clearly all the documentation was hidden or destroyed. This is also for Complex Osufka, and you can sort of get a taste of how the engineering worked. And so these rail tracks are from the war and were used to cart out the rubble. And what they would do is build concurrent parallel tunnels, one on top of each other, and then collapse the floor / ceiling to make a much larger room. And here you can see one of those larger rooms. This, it's hard to get a sense of scale, but this room is like 20 meters, like something like over 60 feet tall and like 100 meters long. And so because of these tunnels, this sort of tweaks your imagination quite a bit. And you're like, wow, they could hide a golden train down here. And so it gives a little bit of credibility, not credibility, but it gives a little bit, I spent a whole chapter discussing some of the conspiracy theories. And once you visit the tunnels, you don't believe them more, but you can sort of see where they get some of their ammunition from. This is also from Osufka. So this is, again, it's open to the public, and you could, there's lights, there's netting to keep rocks from falling. It's hard, where the photographer is standing until the end of the second room is over 200 meters. And so the size of it is really staggering for, an underground factory or barracks. And so those are the photos I have. Yeah. And so that's Project Riza.
Oh, you can imagine what it took for slave labor to build those underground tunnels. It's fascinating. If you could have included the photos are incredible. Would you have wanted to include any of them in the book, or other photos, maybe of people you met?
I don't actually know exactly what happened, but it was decided very early that there were not going to be photos. I think the sense was, I don't know entirely. I think partly it was an issue of expense. I think for these sort of photos to be in the book, they would have to be in color. And so I think that would really add to the expense. And I think also there was a sense of putting photos in would make it less literary or something. And I think there was an attempt to sort of market it as a more literary book, but I really wasn't part of those conversations. And I at that time, I was just sort of agreeing to everything. I think if it happened now, I would be slower. I was like, people, it really adds quite a bit. And so I'm working on to add these photos to my website. And so people could go take a look. And so that should be done within a few weeks.
They're great. So I'm going to turn now to the Q&A. Anyone who has any questions, please put them in the Q&A part of your PowerPoint. Someone wrote, I read your book. It was not clear to me why you did not tell the current residents of your family's building that you were not interested in taking possession of the building. Did I? Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I whether I was interested or not wasn't really the relevant question because it wasn't my decision to make. And so I would be very reluctant to sort of make promises that I couldn't keep. And so to engage even in that kind of question was far too fraught. And so in a way, I'm sort of this, I'm a messenger for my family back home to the people in the building. And so, yeah, the fact that I'm not interested in repossessing their apartments might not be that helpful in the long run. So I just didn't engage.
Yeah. So along those lines, someone wonders where your thinking stands regarding this issue currently, if you struggle with the sort of complex morality of reclaiming property from people who had nothing to do with taking it away.
Sure. I don't know if the questioner read, I don't know if the questioner is asking, oh, so in the book you struggle with their complex.
Yeah.
Oh, you're saying has my thinking changed since I wrote the book?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Maybe a little bit. I think since I wrote the book and have sort of been talking about it with people and people have read it, people have really sought to compare it, do like a comparative analysis of different issues of reclamation around the world. And that was an idea I had while writing, that to maybe include some of that, to maybe make it more of a treatise on reclamation. And so I wouldn't say necessarily the question of this building has changed so much, but I think I've really been fortunate to have a lot of conversations with other people who've gone through reclamation and to see how nuanced and complicated it can get in particular cases and also in particular countries. So anywhere from, I have a friend who is reclaiming her family property on the Ivory Coast. And like, it's just a whole different set of like morality and questions, and in Cape Town or, just around the world.
So someone would like to know if there's been any developments on the reclamation since the book was published.
Yep. So what happened, for those who haven't read the book ends, nothing happens and I sort of like throw my hands up and I'm like, I don't know, whatever. I can't do it. I have to finish this book. I don't know what's going to happen. The day I submitted my drafts to the editor, the courts got back to me and like we had cleared the next hurdle. And then that was not the last step, but it was sort of the setup to the last step. We had a court case to sort of the court. There was a court. My father testified on Passover this past year. There was a trial we did it by Zoom where that decision was about passing the estate down from my grandfather, from my great grandfather to my grandfather, and from my grandfather to my father. The court sort of inexplicably only agreed to the first transfer. They only agreed to transfer it from my great grandfather to my grandfather, despite the fact that I have my grandfather's death certificate, which was almost without a doubt the most outrageous decision. It was like sort of the most unambiguously unfair and unjustified decision. And so we are in the process of appealing that.
Yeah. So someone wrote, was there ever a time in your exploration where you felt akin to your ancestors, you felt Abraham's presence? And then what motivated you to join Steve? This is at the end of the book, and his search for his family's treasures. And you do end the book with a kind of cliffhanger. So she wants to know, when the brick in the wall in the attic of a private resident was loosened and Steve said, "Oh my God," had he found his father-in-law's golden eggs?
So for the question about the eggs, you have to write me personally. There's a little bit of a, I will tell the answer, but it's a little bit of a give and take. And then in terms, did I relate to people? A little bit. I think there was something very moving for me in discovering all of Abraham's story, but it was also a little bit disconcerting because while I learned more and more about Abraham's story, I was still faced with how little I knew about my own grandfather. So that was a tension of sort of like being immersed in a grandfather who wasn't mine and having sort of like a pseudo or alternate grandfather. I think there was a third question there, but I don't remember it.
And someone asked, what really was your end purpose with this whole endeavor? I mean, I'm sure like it changed from the beginning to the end. So
My real purpose. I don't, there's no secret purpose. There's nothing underhanded here. I pretty much lay it. I don't know if that questioner has read the book or not. It's an interesting question either way. I'm pretty honest about it. To me, it was like a set of questions that I was interested in, and it was a way for me to sort of access like all these sentimental questions that I had no way to access. And so in like a sort of more poetic sense, it was like a way for me to develop a relationship with my grandfather. And in a sort of like more prosaic one, it was a way for me to just sort of get into it. And like I was actually legitimately interested. I was motivated. The story got strange. The story got rich. I wanted to see it through.
yeah. So I was asked to ask you about the difference between second and third generation takes on the Holocaust. So I'm second generation, you're third generation. Some people say that the third generation comes to it a little bit maybe cleaner than the second generation. The second generation really was raised by the survivor. I have my own feelings about it, but I was wondering if you had any takes on that second versus third generation.
To be really honest, is that I actually don't feel comfortable acting as a spokesperson for third generation because I think I'm pretty atypical. I think for most people I know, and I know many people who identify as 3G, I think many of them had relationships not only with their grandparents, but with their grandparents' stories. And so I did not know their story, and I still do not their story. And so I have my personal thing. I literally did write a book about it, but I don't, it isn't like, I'm not totally comfortable with the type, and like, I don't totally fit in. And so to the extent that there's a difference to me, I was like, yeah, I see one, like, I think you have a different relationship with your parents than you do with your grandparents. I just think your parents' experiences are going to be so much closer and so much more, whatever kind of word you want to use in terms of trauma, in terms of like impact, in terms like but I am not, I have no authority to speak to this. Like, I'm not a psychologist. I really just know me. And so, and even that, I'm still scratching the surface. And so, yeah, I'd like, but yeah, I don't know. I think it's one of those things that are sort of apparent.
Yeah. I, for one, really appreciate your honesty and your candor. And I personally feel that there's no, we're all so different. I mean, survivors there are as many types of survivors as, everyone survived very differently. And then the second generation, there's every type of, I think what you and I have in common is that we are interested in exploring and we want to ask questions and we want to know. We really want to know. And I think that you have done an incredible thing with your legacy, with your grandfather's legacy. And I'm sure that your parents and siblings and cousins and aunts and uncles are so proud of what you've accomplished. So I don't know, does anybody have one last question? We maybe have time for one more question. Oh, I should just say that anyone who has any questions for Menachem can email him at plunder.booktalk@gmail.com, and that's in the chat. And let me see if there's any more questions here that I've I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. There's very many good questions. Wait, hold on. But again, there's always a second chance because you can email Menachem. Let's see. All right, somehow I'm not able to get the question and answer pop up. Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
Everyone says, thank you. What was the most, this is interesting. What was the most surprising thing you discovered about yourself as a result of this exploration?
The most surprising thing I discovered about myself. I don't, gosh. There's you sort of find your stamina, like you get really pushed, but you see where your breaking points are. And so I would not have known how tiring it could be. And the fact that I was able to pull through, but sometimes really just kind of collapsed. And so I found my breaking points, I think, in a way that I never had before.
Yeah, you even at one point in the book talk about being exhausted and about all the travel and I was exhausted sometimes reading about I can't imagine where you slept, where you ate, how you were,
Yeah.
And somebody else wants to know what's up with your mom.
I think on a previous interview, my mother asked a question in the chat and she said, I quote, I don't have a question, but I do have an answer, which is yes, he's single. And then I took, so I took a screenshot of that and then I put it on Twitter, and I had barely had used Twitter in my life, but that went legitimately viral. So we got 100,000 likes and several million on Instagram. And then I was interviewed by British tabloids. So for those who want context, so my mom's doing great. Yeah, my mom is a Twitter sensation, which is I feel like she should be tweeting more. And so she's doing well. Thank you for asking, Andrew.
You're going to be so busy, Menachem. Okay. Well, it was a pleasure. And I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Bernice. It was really a pleasure.
And thank you both so much for really a wonderful conversation. We could keep going. Menachem, we wanted to ask you if you'd be willing to read just a brief excerpt from the book to give us a little taste and leave us wanting more.
Sure. So this is from the last chapter of the book where I sort of contemplate the fact that I wasn't able to conclude it successfully. I wish I knew my grandfather. I wish I knew his history. It's a kind of longing for longing. I want to be able to mourn. I do not trust the genre I am writing in, that of the grandchild trekking back to the Altaheim on his fraught memory mission. It's too certain, too sure-footed. Meaning is too quickly and too definitively established. There is no acknowledgement of the abyss, the void, the unknowable space between your story and your grandparents' story. I admit I'm also jealous. All the other grandchild authors seem to be able to so easily access the memory and the meaning of the memory of their grandparents. I get why we write these stories this way, why we frame our memory descents as missions. It's what's expected, it's what works, it's what's most suspenseful and most accessible and most marketable. And also when you're in it, it does feel like a mission. There are places to go, obstacles to surmount, clues to discover, but it's a lie, or at least not the truest truth, because mission suggests the possibility of completion, redemption, catharsis. But there can be no completion, redemption, catharsis, because our stories are not extensions of our grandparents' stories, are not sequels. We do not continue their stories, we act upon them, we consecrate, and we plunder.
Wow, that was really powerful. Thank you so much. It does really get at that question Bernice asked about the generations and the stories being handed down. Thank you so much, Menachem. Thank you, Bernice. And we do want to remind the audience that you can purchase signed copies of Plunder through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. If you use the coupon code here, AMINSP20, when you order online, they will waive the shipping fee. And before we close, I just want to let those of you bibliophiles in our audience know about a couple of online book events we have coming up. On Tuesday, August 5th, the American Inspiration Series hosts author Sean Evans and moderator Robin Young, discussing Evans's new book, Maiden Voyages, Magnificent Ocean Liners and the Women Who Traveled and Worked Aboard Them. And please save the date for Tuesday, September 14th, when the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center presents an online program featuring author Lucy Adlington, who will be talking about her new book, The Dressmakers of Auschwitz, The True Story of the Women Who Sewed to Survive. Please join us. So I want to thank again Menachem Kaiser and Bernice Lerner, and of course all of you in our audience for joining us this evening. After this webinar, you will be asked to take a brief survey about the program. We hope you'll take a minute to fill it out, as your feedback is really valuable to us in helping us develop further programming. We will also send you a follow-up email with the link to this presentation so you can watch it again if you missed anything. I invite you to learn more about the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center on our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. And I do want to mention that this free program is made possible by contributions to New England Historic Genealogical Society and the Jewish Heritage Center from people all over the world. So we ask you to please consider making a donation of your own. Thank you. We hope you'll join us again for our upcoming programs. And until then, we wish you good health and a happy summer season. Goodbye for now.